Hello guys, this is CannibalChess, and this video is going to be dedicated to talking about the knights. And just like in my previous video, the one on bishops, we're going to be talking about some of the same concepts, so going over where to place your knight in different stages of the game, also the main functions of the knight, and what the best case scenario is for a knight, or basically what a hyperactive knight looks like, and then when should you trade your knight off the board for having bishops instead. Okay, so let's start by talking about where to place the knights at the beginning of the game. So if you're playing as white here, already you have a few good moves for your knights. You can play knight f3. You could also play knight c3. And the reason why you won't really want to play knight a3 or knight h3 is because the knights on those squares aren't hitting as many squares as they could be. So like on this square, for instance, the knight is hitting h4, it's hitting d4, it's hitting e5, it's hitting g5. So it's hitting all of these forward squares. If you play something like knight here, it's only hitting these two squares. So it's not as good if you play a knight move where it's on the end of the board. So you usually want to play knight to f3, something like this. You could also push a pawn first and then play knight f3. Would be fine as well because the knight is putting pressure on this e5 pawn. This is something that bishops can't really do at the beginning of the game. They're not very good about pressuring central pawns early on. That's kind of the knight's job in the opening, so that's one function of the knight in the opening, is to pressure central pawns and also defend central squares like this d4 square, for instance. And there are two other squares that your knights can come to, and that it's perfectly fine for them to come to. You could bring your knight to e2 or to d2. Just make sure that you have already gotten your bishops out or have fianchettoed them so the knights aren't blocking them in. And so I'm going to show you all an example of when this could be used real quick. So after you play an opening on something like this, instead of going at knight f3 like you usually would, you could play something like knight e2 here. And the idea of playing knight e2 here, obviously you want to get your knight out somehow to be able to castle, but it's also keeping this f2 pawn from being blocked in, because if the knight's on f3, it's blocking this pawn from moving forward. But if you move the knight to e2, then you can play f4 at some point, and this bishop's also guarding that square, the knight's guarding that square, and then also if you castle, then the rook's also going to be hitting this square. So if you continue something like this, then you can play f4 here, and the knight's not blocking the f3 square, so the pawn can move forward, and then this will help you gain more control of the center of the board. If they take here, that's even better, because then you can take back with the knight and then play something like knight here, or you could take back with the bishop as well and then get your bishop activated. So those are a few ideas. Also, if they don't take, then you can just push the pawn up, and then that'll just be blocking their bishop from coming out. So those are a few things that you could do with your knight instead of playing f3 and just c3 if you wanted to. You might think that's kind of boring. Also here, there's another thing you could do where you could bring your knight over here instead. So if you don't want to push the pawn, you could play something like knight over here to c3, and then you could bring it up here, and then you could even bring the knight out to c3 then. So there's like a lot of different things you could do with your knights. You could bring them over here, you could bring this one up first, and then you could bring this one over here. It depends on where you want to attack, stuff like that. Now you do have to be careful in positions like this though, because if you start moving your knights around too much, you just have to make sure that there's still some piece. It could be a bishop or even a pawn. If some trade happens like this, then the pawn here would be guarding the square, and then you could continue like this. But there needs to be some piece, either bishop, pawn, knight, that's guarding against their knight from coming to this kind of outpost. So if you play something like this, knight c3, just thinking, well, I'm going to develop to d5 next because I have support, then that's blocking this pawn from coming to c3 and then defending this d4 square. So then they could jump over here, and if your knight wasn't here on e2 or f3 to attack this knight, then they would have a very nice centralized knight. But here, because your knight's on e2, then you can just simply take, and then after they retake with the bishop, something like that, then your position's fine here. And now moving over to black right here, there are a few positions that you can get into as well, like this one, where white has their bishop pinning your knight to the king. And so this is another function of knights in the opening. Sometimes they just have to be blocks for the king. And sometimes you don't really want to block with the bishop, because you want the bishop to be here just in case it wants to come to e6 and then keep this knight from having an outpost on d5. As I mentioned before, bishops can help with uprooting knights from outposts, stuff like that. So sometimes the knights have to act as blocks as well. Okay, so now we're going to move on to a scenario in the middle game. So as you can see, the knights are on the squares that I mentioned earlier. So for black, the black camp, the knight went to e7 and then c6. So these are pretty normal squares to see knights on. And here, the main goal for knights usually is to be able to get to some kind of outpost, like d4 would be a nice outpost, but not right now though, because if you try and play d4 right now, then either the bishop or this knight could capture the knight on d4, and then your outpost would be gone for your knight. So you usually want to wait for the position to get a little bit less complex. If you and your opponent are going to trade bishops, then trade the bishops off the board before trying for something like going d4, something like that, because your opponent's not really going to want you to have an outpost here, because then you're going to be defending or like attacking all of these squares on their side of the board. So just wait for the position to open up and get a little less complex. And then also for this knight, there's also an idea here where black, after they castle, then their knight is in this position to where I mentioned earlier with white, where the knight was on e2. So after black castles here, then they might have some ideas of pushing f5 here and then trying to break open the center of the board and get the game a little bit more in their favor as well. But just remember, if you are going to push f5 or for white push f4, then just make sure to bring your king over to h8 or h1 for white, because you don't want your king, after this diagonal opening is opened up, you don't want your king to be attacked by any like light square bishops or queens or anything. So just make sure that your king's safe before you try for anything like this. And now we're going to continue by going over discovered checks a little bit. So knights are kind of a unique piece in that they can't really attack the king diagonally, really. The queen and the bishop can do that. The rooks can kind of do that too, not diagonally, but like vertically and horizontally. But knights are the only piece that can't really go on some like exact straight path and attack a piece. So knights are very good about discovered checks and discovered attacks. So we're just going to go over one real quick. And so if you move your rook over to e8, something like this, and then your opponent plays something like queen to d2, for example, then this is completely winning for black. And it might seem a little strange. It might be like, well, where's the winning move? And it might be hard to spot for some of y'all, but there's a move you can do where you move the knight out of the way, because it's in the way right now. The bishop can't really attack the king because the knight's in the way, so you can move the knight out of the way. And then after you move the knight out of the way, so let's say something like knight goes here to b3. And so it might look like, well, your opponent can take, but your opponent cannot take your knight because the bishop is now attacking the king because you moved the knight away. So now the king either has to move, or you have to or white has to block with something like the bishop here, or the queen here, or the rook. So if you block with the bishop, then now black is going to be able to take the queen basically for free here, and they'll also be attacking the rook after that. So if you attack or defend with the bishop, then it's no good. If you defend with the queen, then it's no good either, because then the bishop can just pick up the queen, and then that's the bishop still checking the king. After you take the bishop, remove the king, then this knight can also pick up the rook as well. So it's making two threats at once, but you can really only, as white, you can really only nullify one threat or stop one threat at a time, and the only threat you can stop is the one on the king, because that's just the rules of chess. So after something like, I don't know, rook here, or after something like queen here, then you're just going to pick up the queen. After something like bishop here, you're just going to pick up the queen this way. Or if the king moves, then you just pick up the queen as well. So that's what a discovered check looks like. They don't always involve the queen. Sometimes you can pick up a rook for a knight, just have a better trade, stuff like that. But yeah, that's just what a discovered check is. And now I'm going to quickly go over what a fork is. So you see the knight here is eyeing this f2 square, and just by itself it wouldn't be able to really do anything. If it took, then the king would just retake. But because this bishop is on c5 and it is eyeing it as well, then this knight will be defended when it takes f2. So here you can play knight f2. And then you are basically forking, so you're hitting the rook and the queen at the same time. And as white, that's what I was talking about with the discovered attack as well. You can only defend one piece. You know, the king can't take because the bishop's defending, so one of the pieces has to move. And of course, you'd rather move your queen, so after you go something like queen e2, then the rook is going to get taken. So that's basically just what a fork is. There are other examples of forks where you could have your knight something like on d4, and then it could jump over here to c2, and then check the king and the rook, and then win the rook. That's a fork that people usually think of when they hear the word fork. So that's the one that you'll usually see. But these are also possible where you can have a square defended by the bishop and then come in with the knight as well. And for any of you who are still watching and you're wondering what happened to my lighting, I took a 3-hour long break to go watch Avatar, and it was actually pretty good. But anyway, so here is the last function that we're going to talk about for knights, kind of in the middle game. So if you notice here, the knight it's just on f6. It's not really doing much. This knight's not really doing much either, but it can get pretty active pretty fast. So in case you didn't see, there's a battery. So the queen and the bishop are making a battery, and they're eyeing this h3 pawn. So here the best move for black is to actually take the pawn. And this might look strange. If you're playing against probably someone below, I would say 1500 maybe, then there's a good chance that they might take. Or maybe 1400, 1300, something like that. Might be a little bit better of an estimate here. There might be a good chance that they'll take. And then here, what you can do as black, you can take back with the queen. And now these two files are opened up, and the knight's job now, the knight on f6, is going to help. So it's going to come over here and then help deliver checkmate, basically, unless white finds a pretty good defense for that. So that's another function of knights, and this is a pretty well-known middle game tactic where the bishop sacrifices itself on h3 or on h6, stuff like that, to open up files to attack the opposite person's king with, stuff like that. And even if they didn't take, so if you take and they don't take because they see, well, it's going to open up the file, they play something like knight g3, and then at some point you're going to want to bring this knight over here to e7, bring it over here to g6, because you're going to want both of your knights in on the attack on the king side, because now this file is open, so the king is more vulnerable. So you're going to want all your pieces to be well coordinated together, especially the knights, because they can protect each other the best, where they where they have the pattern where they both are shaped in the L and protecting each other. So they're going to be really good together over here attacking the king as well. And now I'm just going to quickly show y'all a unique checkmating pattern that you can sometimes see. It's kind of rare, but you can sometimes see it when you have knights in this kind of situation where they're close to the king's on h1, stuff like that, and then you have something like the queen on this diagonal here. So what you can do here as black, let's just say that white just played this move f3 trying to kick away the knight, and they didn't see this idea. So what you can play here is you can play knight to f2. And this actually forces white to take the knight with the rook, because if they don't, and if they think, well, I can just get out of this, I can play something like king g2 here, or king g1, and then I'll be fine. This is actually, there's a checkmate in 3 here. It's a forced checkmate. So what you can do, as I was talking about earlier with discovered checks and stuff like that, so you can play knight to h3 here. So play knight h3, so that gets the queen attacking the king. Also, the knight is attacking the king, so you can't just block with the bishop here, because then the knight would still be attacking. So you have to move the king back to h1, and then once the king moves back to h1, then you can now play this queen check on g1, and the king can't take because the knight is guarding the queen, and you can't really take the knight because you're in check, so the rook has to take the queen. It's the only legal move for white here. So after the rook takes, then it's checkmate in 1, so you just move the knight back to f2, and then this is called a smothered mate. So the knight delivers checkmate here, and white's own rook is blocking the king in, so the king has nowhere to escape. Okay, so switching over to white and going to the endgame, there is a rook and a knight against 2 rooks. So this should be pretty bad for white, and the computer's saying it is, but I did make this a situation to where there is a small tactic, and this happens a lot in endgames that involve knights, where your opponent's just kind of overlooking small things. But here, what you can do as white is, I mean, obviously the knight can't play over here. You don't really want to go back. I mean, you could go to d2 and then come back to e4, attack this pawn, but that's just a lot of moves. What you can do here as white is you can play knight g5. And so this is creating a fork as well. So you're forking the rook, and you're forking the pawn on h7. And you don't want your rook to be taken, so obviously you have to move it. If you attack the knight, then you're just going to have your rook taken. So the rook has to go to something like e7, and then maybe you might have a trade, and then the knight can just pick up the pawn on h7. And the position here is still losing for white, obviously, but this is a circumstance where you can use every single piece, even though it looks like you're down material kind of. They have a rook for a knight, but you still need to use every single piece to the best of its ability. So you can find little tactics like this where you can just fork a rook and a pawn, and then just get a few more pawns off the board from your opponent's side, and anything like that would help you in an endgame like this. But also, what you could potentially, I mean, the knight on f3 is also doing quite a bit as well, because now black can't really push here. If black pushes d5 without having the rook support, stuff like that, and then you take with your pawn, then this is now freeing up this square, because the pawn right now is guarding this square, so the knight can't jump to it. If they play this pawn move, then the knight's going to be able to jump here and then start attacking the rook, and then maybe backwards pawns as well. So playing this move wouldn't be very good for black. So the knight staying on f3 is kind of hindering black from making progress on this side of the board, kind of, because now this pawn can't really move forward very easily. Okay, so moving on to basically the end of the game here. The knight is obviously covering f6, the king is covering e6. So right away, the obvious functions of this knight is that it's keeping the king from coming to this square. So the king can't really come down to attack this pawn that's undefended right now. And so this king is defending this square. So if the king wanted to, it would have to come all the way over here to attack the pawn, and then even then it can't really reach this square because the knight's defending that square as well. So here the function of the knight is to just defend key squares in the endgame. And I know the computer's saying that this endgame is completely losing for white, but I just wanted to show a losing endgame instead of like a winning one. You know, just to show you what you should try in an endgame where you're kind of losing, just to have some chances. So obviously you could keep this knight on this square trying to defend these, but another idea that you could have as white, you could play something like knight c3. And this might seem kind of weird, you're moving the knight away from this pawn, so you're not really defending it anymore. But what you can do here, so let's just say your opponent plays, I don't know, something like king here. And then what you can do as white is you can play knight a4 now, because you brought your knight over here to c3, so it can jump to a4. And then now this rook it can't really defend two pawns at once, so it can't really defend this one on b6 and the one on d6 at the same time. So here it just kind of becomes a race. The king might come down here, and then you might pick up this pawn, and then you have a passed pawn. And so now you made it a little bit of trouble for your opponent, and they might have a hard time trying to defend your pawn from getting promoted, and then also trying to promote their own pawn. So here, this is kind of like your best chance in this situation of trying to squeeze out a draw or a win. And now we're going to briefly go over what a hyperactive knight looks like and what kind of the best scenario is in, I would say, about a middle game area for having a hyperactive knight. Okay, so going back to black here real quick, this is probably one of the best scenarios that you will ever see in your own personal games. So the knight on d4 here is a hyperactive knight. It's placed at a very, very good spot in the board. It's hitting this square. It's also hitting this square. So the queen can't really move too far away. If the queen moves off of this diagonal, then you're already going to be able to create a fork and then get the rook. Also, it's hitting this weak pawn on f3. And it's also, as I said before, hitting e2. So the king can't really go to e2 if it had to. It's already cutting off a square for the king, and that's always a good sign. And a few more reasons why this knight is so good is because the e pawn and the c pawn have already been pushed past it. So these pawns can't really go back and attack the knight anymore. So usually you'd want to bring your pawns up here, probably kick away the knight would be a good idea because of how strong it is. But here you would have to do it with probably the dark square bishop. It would be the most reasonable thing to do it with. And then you're just getting your opponent's bishops off the board, which is usually a good idea, especially in an open position like this. As I mentioned in my bishop video, bishops are usually good in open position. So if you can get your opponent's bishops off the board in an open position, then you probably have a really good chance of winning the game in general. And what you could also do as black here, it might look kind of strange, but you can actually play knight h5 here. And this is actually one of the best moves in the position for black. I know I said in the earlier parts of this video that you usually don't want to play the knights on the end of the board, but in this example, this is actually a very good move because not because of this square in particular, but because of the square that it can jump to next move. So it's now eyeing this f4 square, and this can be another outpost for this knight. So then both of these knights would be pretty active. This one would be keeping the bishop over here from getting fianchettoed and getting a little bit more active on this diagonal. So that would be a good move for this knight as well to get a little bit more active. And now I'm going to briefly go over how and when to trade down knights. So in this position, this pawn structure here is a little bit more open than the one you saw if you watched my bishops video. The one you saw in that video was a very closed pawn structure. This one's kind of more open. So this is the ideal situation for bishops, not necessarily for knights, because if you look, if your opponent here, if white tries to play something like knight g5, there's really no square that's open for the knight to come to from that square. So then you could just play like something like h6 and then just kick it back. And same for if you're playing as black. There's really nowhere to go with the knights here that's pretty good because all these pawns are guarded. There's really nothing you can do here. Even if you try and play something like a5, then you're not really going anywhere. This square is guarded, this square is guarded. So what you can do here as black, if you're playing black, you can bring your knight up here, and you're threatening, so you're forking the bishop and the knight, and your opponent, seeing that the pawn structure is open, like what I just said, they don't really want their bishop to be taken, so they decide to take your knight. You can retake with the pawn, and then now you're threatening your opponent's knight, so they want to move their knight. They can move it to something like d5, and then now they have a knight on the outpost. You don't really want them to have a knight on the outpost, so you could do something like take the knight, they would retake, and then you would kind of have this sort of strange position. So the light square bishop is now very good, and the dark square bishop, it would be pretty easy to get it pretty good, because your opponent wants to get their dark square bishop active as well. So they would probably push c3 at some point to try and get this diagonal open, and then you would also get an open diagonal because of that as well. So here's that's an example of how and when you would want to trade knights. And so yeah, this was my guide on knights, just almost everything knight related. I know it wasn't as many as the other guide on bishops, but I had more stuff to talk about. Knights are a little bit more complex than bishops, just because bishops just move diagonally. Knights have a little bit more complexity to them. So I hope you enjoyed this video and got something out of it. If you did, please consider subscribing to the channel, and thanks for watching.